Today, we are thrilled to be joining Dr. Heather Middleton, who we actually had the pleasure of meeting when we were on the site in Heron Island for the show. She's been scientific officer with Heron Island Research Station since 2021. Prior to that, she got her PhD from the University of Queensland, which is associated with Heron Island Research Station. And for her PhD, she focused on pheromone utilization in elasmobranchs branks with a special focus on the Epaulette shark. So welcome, Dr. Middleton.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, over the internet. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I wanted to start by talking about field stations because Chris and I absolutely love field stations. Honestly, they've been the places in my life that have probably been most instrumental just as a person, also as a scientist and teacher too. But I feel like field stations bring people together in a way that cities can't really match. Like you just have such tight relationships with people at field stations because you spend every waking minute with everyone around you. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what the Heron Island Research Station does, not only in terms of research and education, but also what are the peculiar little things that happen there that make it special and that keep you coming back?
Yeah, well, the employment is the main thing that keeps me coming back, that's for sure. No, you're right. Field stations are definitely a unique place, and they do bring people together, and you learn a lot about yourself and you learn a lot about other people. Some of it welcome, some of it not so much. One of the beauties of this place is I can look out my window and I can see the reef right there. So it's super accessible. So the station sits on 1/4 of the island. It's a tiny island, and we've got a saltwater intake system that draws straight from the channel. Salt water gets pumped in through the station. It goes straight through that main research deck and then straight back out to the reef. So we've got this high flow through seawater system. So people can literally walk out to the flat, collect their samples, bring them back straight away, put them in a tank, and then they're using that exact same seawater to run their experiments. So it's a really, how do I put this? It's a convenient place to do coral reef research. Like we've got a high biodiversity out there. It's in a green zone on the Great Barrier Reef as well. So it's protected. So that biodiversity is sort of a little bit more protected than you'll find in other areas as well. It's accessible if they need to get anywhere else. We've got a couple of boats that they can chuff around the other parts of the island to get to. But yeah, we've got these really cool aquarium facilities here, and that flow through seawater system that maintains really high water quality as well. So people can pretty much go out, grab what they need, work with it here, depending on what their permit allows. They can put it back if they're allowed to, or they can take it off with them. It's a really important bird sanctuary as well. So we get bird researchers here in the middle of the year looking at our resident silvereye population and looking at the speciation of them. But we've also got the mutton birds and the noddies and all the migratory birds that come back over in summer. And what's actually really interesting, what I find really interesting about Heron is that we have such a huge bird population that comes in the summer, and think of all the bird shit that they're going to dump. You would expect like a guano hardpan to form, but the reason why that hasn't formed is because we've got these burrowing mutton birds that keep churning up that surface. Whereas if we didn't have the mutton birds, we'd have that guano, we would have mining, we'd have guano mining here. And so because these mutton birds existed here, we didn't have that guano form. We then had no mining, which meant the natural order of the island was preserved pretty much. So thanks to the mutton birds, miners didn't move in and take all the phosphate. So that's one thing that kind of led to the preservation of the island, which I think is a pretty cool link. But those chicks are about to leave now, thank God, because they're so bloody loud. But yeah, so from the natural perspective, it's incredibly convenient. From a scientific perspective, it's got such a long history of research that it's a really good baseline to build up more data on. So that's pretty important for continuing research as well. It's really difficult to start from scratch in anywhere. So because we've got such a long history of coral reef research at this one location, it makes sense to sort of keep going at this one spot. Like one of the first publications I think was released in the 1930s. That was the first official publication. Research had been going here for a bit longer before that. Obviously, it's an important bird sanctuary as well as the turtles as well. So a long turtle research history here. So yeah, incredibly important naturally and scientifically. So yeah, actually, I wrote it down somewhere. We've got about 140 theses have been published since the 1960s. So student work is incredibly important here too. So that's masters, honors, PhDs. So not even big researchers. These are just students here. So yeah, we do a lot of student work too. Incredibly important research.
Yeah, I mean it's incredible. I mean, I think the long-term ecological data is so important across the board. I mean, we're realizing that everywhere in the world right now to understand natural fluctuations and patterns, as you alluded to. You've got terrestrial and marine sort of intersection there, and you've got it's a small island, again speaking to the uniqueness of this place, but has this rich history of all these people that have come there to do these projects. So a very cool, like, sort of natural laboratory in that mindset, and you have access to all of it because it's just all around you. So I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, we've got not just nerdy coral people, we've got nerdy bird people, we've got nerdy rock people. It's a really diverse group of researchers that we get on this pretty little island. Yeah.
I love all the history of Heron Island, and when we were there, we read a little bit about how people discovered it and started to actually fish there, not only for like the usual suspects, but also turtles. Could you tell us like a little about that history? Because it's so cool how it's gone like from one thing to the next over the years.
Yeah, so in the 1920s, I think it was Heinz. They set up shop on the resort side of the island. So that's the northwestern corner where the resort is now. So there's a big wooden gantry on the reef flat there, which I think is where they used to pull the boats in to load turtles up. So they used to fish the turtles in the area or hunt the turtles in the area for turtle soup. They realized pretty quickly that that was an unsustainable practice because those things live for a very long time. While they might lay lots of eggs, not many of them survive. So they realized that the population was not able to sustain that level of fishing. So they canned it within a couple of years. So like a fishery was able to start and die within a decade, I think less than a decade, because it was just so unsustainable. Then I think the resort, not the current operators obviously, but then a resort took over the lease of that land, or sort of took ownership of those buildings, and then they turned it into a resort. And that's actually where the first researchers came before the research station was built. So it had a bit of a dark history there, took out most of the turtles in the area, almost all the turtles in the Capricorn Cape Bunker group of islands. But they're slowly clawing themselves back, population numbers. And now we've got a resort over there, and now we've got a research station here who are trying to fix that 100 years later. So yeah, it was a quick fishery, but it did a lot of damage.
Say that's a good lesson to be learned for fisheries. The impact you can have from a very short-term fishery can have long-lasting effects.
Yeah, when you don't have the biological data of a population, if you don't have all that information that you need about the longevity of the species, the fecundity, the survival rate, if you don't have all of that, then you've got no business fishing. And then, oh gosh, not to mention the turtle rides that they used to do up until the 60s, I think, where nesting females would come up to the beach, and then they'd flip them over to keep them there until the morning, and then they'd flip them back over so that the resort guests could ride them down and race them down the beach. And it just shows that humans as a species have come a little bit further in terms of animal ethics over the last couple of years too, and we just want to keep moving in that direction and learn from those mistakes, and let's not revisit them.
Yeah, but it's encouraging at the same time, because, going from the turtle cannery to then a resort where then people aren't necessarily eating them, but they're still harassing them at a critical life stage. And now all of a sudden it's what you said, a green zone, right? So is that a no-take area on the Great Barrier Reef?
Yeah, it's completely no-take, but all turtles in Australian waters are protected as well. Gotcha. Oh, except for traditional fisheries. But otherwise, yeah, completely protected. So, and have been since I want to say in the 60s, but I'm not too sure about the exact dates there. But yes, they are protected now.
We saw a huge diversity of sharks and rays at Heron, both snorkeling and diving, things like reef-associated sharks. We saw the wobbegong, of course, but then also in the shallows, just snorkeling around and even wading around, we saw the brown-banded bamboo shark. We saw tons of different ray species, and even giant guitarfish. And we noticed that lots of the individuals we saw were very, very small.
The guitarfishes, the wedge fishes, the banjo rays, the shovel-nosed rays, these guys are some of the most threatened animals on the planet. We can find a ton of them here at Heron Island.
We've read up on this a little bit, and it seems like Heron Island is an important nursery ground for lots of these species, giant guitarfish included. So I was wondering if you could speak to the importance of Heron Island to sharks and rays and their unique diversity that is really high there in an otherwise landscape of threat throughout much of the ranges of these species, and in particular, how Heron Island functions as a nursery for many of them.
Yeah, so Heron Island being a green zone is incredibly important for that, in that respect. So as you mentioned, the guitarfish, they, yeah, you would have seen heaps of them under the jetty, and then, yeah, dozens of the babies around the shallows on the other side of the island. So it's an incredibly important nursery ground for them, because as I mentioned, it's a critically endangered species. So, you know, to see it successfully breeding, that species successfully breeding here is refreshing. And I'm not sure if you saw any while you were here, but in the last couple of months, we've still been seeing a lot of pregnant white-tip reef sharks as well. And we see a lot of white spot eagle rays performing their little mating rituals. Actually, I don't really like the term rituals. It's more innate than that. You know, they're performing their little mating behaviors, I guess. So a lot of things breed here, or at least spend part of their pregnancies here. You know, the shovel nose rays are really the main babies that we see. So some of the others must give birth or lay eggs elsewhere. Obviously the epaulettes are quite resident here, so they'll live their entire life here, and we do find a couple of little babies, but they're really cryptic. So most of the babies would be quite cryptic, and they either might hook off the edge of the reef crest and then go for deeper waters, so we don't see many of them, so we don't really know what happens to them. But we do see a couple of baby lemon sharks. So we've got the sickle fin lemon shark on our side of the world. We do see a couple of baby lemons, a couple of baby black tips. So it's a really important habitat for them, and because there's a lot of protection behind some of these rock walls, and at low tide on the reef flat, they get a little bit more protection from those larger predators as well. So and then obviously being a green zone as well, they get a bit more protection from the fishermen. And you can tell in the behavior of the animals that they can recognize the zoning as well. So if you go out to the conservation zone next door where you are allowed to fish, the behavior of those same white tips is erratic. It's completely different. It's more wild. So you can tell that they're more comfortable in the green zone around the tourists. They might not like being in the face of a tourist, but they are more comfortable in their swimming behavior. So you can tell that they're more relaxed here, and that's obviously a better way to be pregnant. I wouldn't know, but I assume I would rather be relaxed if I was pregnant. So yeah, it's yeah, we see a lot of babies, we see a lot of pregnant animals, we see a lot of mating as well. So for critically endangered animals, it's a really important site.
You're talking about the Epaulette shark before. Arguably, they're kind of the superstar of Heron Island, right? They're it's one of the only places you can reliably see them in shallow waters, and you focus on them for your PhD or dissertation work. So maybe, and they're the cool species that one of the walking shark species, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about what makes them such a unique species, and what made you want to study them for your PhD.
Yeah, so what makes them unique is pretty much their ability to withstand anoxic or hypoxic conditions, so low or no oxygen conditions. But that wasn't necessarily why I wanted to deal with them. I wanted to work with them because they are abundant and easy to collect. From a research funding perspective, that's always desirable traits. And on Heron Island, so this is a UQ facility, and I did my research through UQ as well. So this was an obvious place for me to come. And, you know, the accessibility of the reef flat and the accessibility of those animals and the abundance of them out on the reef flat made them like a perfect model for me to start this area of research. So yeah, they were the perfect model species for that. And there was enough background research on their biology. So I was looking at their olfaction, their sense of smell, and their pheromone use, or whether or not they even used pheromones. So for me to start at that point, I needed enough background biology information as well. You can't just pick any old species where no information is available to them, because you kind of need to find that background biological information first. And so there was enough information on epaulettes first for me to then start at this point. So yeah, so Heron Island was the perfect place to start, because there was also a little bit of abundance data for that species here as well. And they're so bloody cute. They're yeah, you see them at low tide and they'll walk along the rocks and they just look so dopey and yeah, they've got remarkable brain chemistry. So there's a team at JCU at the moment who's looking at you know, how heat stress is going to affect their survival. There's another team down at Griffith University as well, I think in conjunction with a team in New Zealand, who looks at their brain chemistry and how they can apply that in a medical sense as well. So they're a unique species of shark. And yeah, very cute and quite charismatic, I think. And they're a nice little learner shark for kids to get them into sharks. Yeah,
it's beautiful. Yeah, we use nurse sharks where we are in the Florida Keys as a primary species for education in particular. I mean, it's so cool. Like Brendan and I were so excited to see epaulette sharks when we were there. We actually struggled a little bit because, you know, when you go to a new place, you don't know all the timing and where to go. We finally figured it out. We only had a few days to really do it. We couldn't talk to people like you to really during the competition side of things to really figure that out. But man, what cool species, and to be able to have evolved to live with no oxygen and to withstand high temperatures. So that's how they've evolved to deal with high these sort of changing coastal extremes, right? And so probably makes them a very good species to look at things like climate change with, because they can't really move away from the reef. They really just have to sort of deal with it, right? And I'm sure that has physiological costs associated with it.
Yeah. So their primary habitat is the reef flat there. They do obviously hook on over the side to the reef crest, but we mainly see them on the reef flat. And if you think about the reef flat as an environment, it's incredibly harsh. It's incredibly sort of dynamic. So you have you know, high tide in the middle of the day. So the tides obviously change twice a day, but high tide in the middle of the day, you know, think of high flow through, you've got sort of consistent water temperature, you know, consistent oxygen, everything's consistent. But if you get a low tide in the middle of the day, you're going to get evaporation. So salinity is going to go through the roof. You're going to get a temperature increase through the roof. All the algae is going to be photosynthesizing. So we've got a researcher had a data logger out there who recorded oxygen concentrations up to like 500% or something. So, you know, you're going to see huge fluctuations. And then at nighttime, you've got, you know, a high tide at nighttime, you've got, you know, that high consistency again. A low tide at nighttime, everything starts respiring. So oxygen plummets, absolutely plummets. So if a shark is hanging out in that environment, it's got to survive oxygen concentrations from near zero to about 500%, and temperature fluctuations and salinity fluctuations just as high. So they've got to figure out a way to either survive or piss off. Sometimes they piss off, but a lot of the times they just kind of hang out. And if they find themselves in a pool that doesn't have enough flow through and they're just like, you know what, I feel like breathing this hour, they can just walk out into, you know, a pool that has a bit of you know, higher flow through. So yeah, it's a dynamic environment and a harsh environment, and they have learnt to stick it out. But in climate change projections as well, if they can, you know, they can survive a temperature up to say this high, and climate change is going to push those temperatures a little bit higher, then if they're already reaching their ceiling, then if climate change is pushing that ceiling higher, then, you know, that's what researchers at JCU were kind of looking at, how that's going to fare. Are they going to be able to adapt? Do they have that plasticity to jump that little extra couple of degrees, or is that them cooked? Hope not. I think they've got the plasticity. I think they'll be fine.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
I
totally.
hope. I have to hope.
Especially for the species that you worked on, like you want to make. I mean, you have a special care for them, right? Of course you do.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, this shark uses pheromones. Oh, it doesn't matter. They've all died.
It's so sad.
I know. What a miserable outlook.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the pheromones? Because we've at one time in the Eastern Bahamas, we saw some sharks exhibiting what we described as courtship behaviors, where the male was following right underneath the female's cloaca. And we hypothesized that maybe he was following her because he was picking up on some pheromones or some olfactory cue that she was receptive to mating. Is that, do you think that's likely? And what did you find out about the epaulettes?
Yeah, so in almost all elasmobranchs, I think in all of them actually that have been documented to date, the courtship behavior follows a very similar kind of pattern, and that is that the male will kind of hunt down a female, one male or a group of males, and then they'll follow, and then it'll eventually be a leading male that performs this nosing behavior, which is that it starts off as tailing and then nosing, where he really gets in there and gives her what looks like a good sniff. And so that nosing behavior has been documented for decades, and that has been what researchers have fallen on to say that, yeah, sharks must use pheromones, because pheromone use has been incredibly well documented for a lot of fish species. So they assumed and extrapolated that sharks must use pheromones as well, and it makes perfect sense. And they've used this nosing behavior as evidence for that as well. And then following the nosing behavior, the male will then start biting pectoral fins and having a go, start being quite aggressive, and you'll see sort of scars and bite marks on the gills and pectoral fins of the females, and on the dorsal side as well. He'll get a good grasp of the pectoral fin. That'll cause her to submit, then they'll flip around and do the dirty. So in almost all elasmobranch species, that's been the pattern of courtship behaviors, of copulatory behaviors. So it's been that nosing that has led people to think that they must use pheromones. And there was a paper released in the 70s of someone documenting the behavior of these, I think they were black tips, where this male was following a feeding trail, and then he beelines away from that and then started to find his way towards a female. But when he made his change of direction, change tack towards the female, she was beyond visual cues, beyond electrosensory, beyond mechanosensory. He had actually just hooked into her odor trail and followed the odor trail around and then found her, and then mating ensued afterwards. So that was a pretty good description of a change in behavior from a male that ended in copulation. That suggests he used odor alone to find her. So we've got, all of this sort of behavioral evidence for decades, but no one really sat down and tried a behavioral experiment to test it empirically, to get the empirical evidence to test it. So one of my experiments for my PhD was a very simple behavior design, where I pretty much just had an epaulette swimming around in my display tank in the arena, had a bucket of a control odor on one side and a bucket that had been conditioned with the odor of a conspecific or another epaulette on the other side. The main example that I use here is I've got a sexually active male in the main arena, and then a sexually active female or an adult female in the odor bucket. Stick her in there pretty much to stink it up, and then take her out. So she's conditioned the water there, and then start the flow of water from both of those buckets in, and then see how his behavior changed in response to that odor. So it was a very simple design, but it removed all other senses from the experiment. So he could only be making his decision based on odor alone. So I pretty much found that males were attracted to food. That was my positive control. So that's a good sign. That demonstrates that the experiment kind of worked. The males were just as interested in the females. So they're hungry and horny. Checks out. This is the breeding season for those sharks. So good stuff. The females, however, were very, 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 very hungry. And I would be too. If I was producing 2 eggs every 2 weeks, these eggs that they produce are like the size of mango seeds. They look like brown mango seeds, actually, because they're kind of furry, like a mango seed, the same size and shape. And if you're producing them with that much fat and yolk, you're investing that much energy into these things every 2 weeks, you're going to be bloody hungry. And so when we collected them, they were the first ones to eat. They didn't even wait till they hit the water before they started feeding. Like, they acclimatized like that. So they love to feed. Can't blame them. So in the experiments, they had a very high affinity for the food odor, but they weren't anywhere near as interested in the male odor. And that probably comes down to the fact that shark sex is pretty brutal for the females. So they were probably like, you know what, I'm happy for a feed. I don't really need that. That's all good. So it was a pretty simple behavioral experiment just to demonstrate that they can locate each other based on odor alone, and that males do pursue or will are attracted to females based on odor alone. So it was just a very simple way of confirming what a lot of observational kind of reports have shown.
Heron Island has been the site of a very long-term monitoring program going back to the 1960s, looking at temperatures and coral health and coral coverage, obviously in probably the most famous coral reef on Earth, in the Great Barrier Reef, right? And so what have you all learned using that long-term monitoring data about the effects of climate change on corals, which of course have experienced some extreme mass bleaching events in recent decades, as well as on sharks and rays, maybe the Epaulette in particular?
So one thing we have learned is that climate change doesn't affect everything equally. A couple of years ago, so 2016, Lizard Island in the northern GBR was hit with a huge bleaching event. And then 2020, Heron Island, I think, copped one of its first major bleaching events, which significantly impacted the reef flat and the lagoon area. But unfortunately, being post-COVID, we didn't have many researchers coming and going and actually being able to get here and monitor. And now we do have those photo quadrats that date back to 1962, I think, the 60s. So that was Jason, Tanner, and Connell, I think. And so that's the longest running sort of photo quadrat data set for corals in existence as well. So that actually, Jason Tanner was back here last year. I think he wanted to take those photos again to see how those areas were going. So, you know, one thing we found is that areas don't respond the same, and everything sort of fluctuates. You know, it hasn't been a constant decline. It seems to have been sort of a fluctuating up and down, slowly kind of thing. And Heron Island, for most of that time, has been spared of those huge bleaching events. It's been primarily up north, but yeah, so 2020 was the first major one we had down here. And then last year, so 2024, so January 2024, we started to see one of like the worst mass coral bleaching event on Heron, but that primarily affected the slope. So even within one area, we see that climate change doesn't affect it the same. So yeah, we saw the reef flat affected worse in that first one, and then the reef slope affected worse the second one. But it could also be that the reef slope was affected worse that second time because most of the reef flat was now more robust corals that survived that first mass bleaching event, or most of those ones died out. You know, we see a loss in biodiversity when we see those mass bleaching events as well. So we know that heating corals too much can kill them, but we also found out that it doesn't always play out how we expect. We can model, but there's always a bit of error around those models. And we just need to allow for adaptation. And if you can allow for a healthy ecosystem to be maintained around that, so as I keep mentioning, it's a green zone, then you you can facilitate, you can allow adaptation within that zone as well. So we see that the zones that are hit worse are sort of the conservation zones, where a lot of overfishing can occur. So if you can maintain healthy habitat around, coral bleaching events, then you're giving the reef the best chance it can to adapt and recover. But you need to facilitate adaptation. And to do that, you need to maintain high populations. So yeah.
Thank you for that lovely description. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this as you've been talking, and I think, sort of looking to the future, you've sort of talked about a lot of these different pieces now of what's happening there and broader on the Grippier Reef. Is there in your mind a way to package what sort of research needs there are that would help to better understand into the future how elasmobranchs and the reef ecosystem overall might respond to some of the warming events, and then maybe follow that up with some of the things you've talked about? Where are there conservation stories locally that maybe give you hope?
Yeah, so for elasmobranchs as well, so there's a couple of areas of research there it's looking at the migratory ones, how their movements will change based on temperatures. So seasonal migrations, their timing is going to be off. Their locations, how far they move, is going to change as well. And so whether they miss time a migration, and then if they arrive before a food source, then they're going to be a bit cooked, that kind of thing. So it's going to be more important now to know their movement. So we've got BioPixel here at the moment, actually, who they're here filming epaulettes, actually, but part of their work is actually animal tracking and tagging. So it's going to be more important to know where they go usually, to then understand how that pattern changes. So for the migratory, for the pelagics, those mobile ones, it's going to be more important to know where they usually go, to then understand how those movements are going to change. And then for the sedentary ones, the resident ones like the epaulettes, we've got got the couple of physiology teams. It's going to be understanding the physiological plasticity and what they can actually handle, what their options are, what are they likely to do, because there's also looking at the developmental side, like the embryonic development, whether temperature or oxygen availability or ocean acidification, how that actually affects the development in egg, in ova, because it seems that babies that grow in sort of higher temperatures actually are born smaller, with lower fitness. So it's kind of things like that. But then those that do actually survive, maybe they've actually got a higher fitness and better adaptive qualities to pass on. So it's kind of like you need to look at the reproductive implications, and then the migratory sort of implications, and then there's quite a few different areas of elasmobranch research that need to be addressed. The science communication is incredibly important here too, because if someone sees more sharks in an area, then they will assume that means the population's fine. But you need a good science communicator to actually explain that, oh no, it's probably because there's no food for them out here, then that's pushing them into here. Or they're seeing a shark in a location that you wouldn't normally, you might see it further north. They think, oh well, that means the population's doing so well that it's pushing them forward. No, it might mean that that there are other factors that are pushing a smaller population into an area that they wouldn't usually be. That doesn't mean the population is big. So science communication is incredibly important. I'm probably not the right person for it, but good science communicators are hard to find. And if you find a good one, then I think you guys are doing a pretty good job here so far.
We're just asking you questions. You're the one talking. And I think you're doing a fantastic job. So
but yeah, it's to try and to try and get the underlying message of the data to people to understand what the problem is, instead of them taking what they're seeing at face value. Them seeing a shark and think, well, the population's fine. It's like, well, no, what is actually causing this is a big problem. And so that's what we see in pretty much every area of science, actually.
This comes up in our minds too, because in all these beautiful places that we've been going and seeing all of these animals, they're chosen for a reason. There's a reason we went to Heron Island. I've never been anywhere like it, where you can walk the shallows and just point at ray after shark all day long, and then go see a beautiful coral reef and hop in and swim with a humpback whale and then see 17 turtles in 5 minutes. Like, these places don't exist. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think it would be easy to see all of this footage and think, oh my God, these animals are all over the place. And that's just not the case. These are often critically endangered animals, and we're going to the select few places where you can still find them pretty quickly.
It's funny that little scenario that you just mentioned there, because anyone listening would probably be like, oh, that's an exaggeration, but that's literally what it's like.
Yeah, it is. So it's unbelievable. Heron Island was like, I mean, it's a playground for anyone who likes wildlife.
It's such a small island, and like, it's just teeming with life. Like, everywhere you go. I mean, Brendan and I did not want to leave, and like you were all talking about at the beginning, this whole like island life. Yeah, it has pros and cons to it, but I think the benefit of where you are is just an extraordinary place, and I know it's easy to take it for granted when you've lived there for a while, and then some of the cons sort of maybe start to outweigh things. But man, like, to visit that place, I like, we couldn't take our eyes off the water anytime we were walking anywhere. There's always something going on, and that is not typical around the world.
Yeah, we are very lucky here.
Well, this has been awesome. I'd say, we really want to thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Middleton. Your insight has been of tremendous value for us better understanding some of the, the ecosystem on Heron Reef, the studies going on there, the species that call it home. And so we just cannot thank you enough for spending your time with us today and going over a lot of these things with us. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Enjoy your night, I believe.
If you're interested in learning more about this world-class research and teaching facility located on the Great Barrier Reef, you can check out their Instagram at Heron Island Research Station, or find them online. We'll put those links in the box below this video, along with references to all the studies we mentioned during this conversation, so you can read the science straight from the source. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. All right, that's all.
Awesome.